Will any other tarp company teach you how to install a tarp system in the dark? I don't think so. Today, we're installing a manual 4-spring dump truck tarp system with a ground level crank box extension on this here truck. Let's get to it. First thing you're gonna need is a little bit of shade. So we're gonna back it up into this very convenient covered shelter. If you can find shelter in the hot summer, that's great. If not, it's better to purchase and install your tarp system in the nice, cool autumn or winter months. It's hot. We got your upper arms and the cross tube. Got your tarp axle. And your lower arms. Lay all that right there for now.
All right, so here we have our 4-spring manual small box. Comes with our manual here. And we have our axle sprocket. Here we have our crank box. Hardware, bearing, stud shaft, bolts. Have our 2 aluminum cast corners. Some extra hardware. Here we have our number 40 10-foot long chain with a master link, and eventually we'll have to cut this down. And we have our 2 sets of springs, 1 for each side. Have our tarp donuts for centering the tarp on the cross tube. And we have our aluminum mounting brackets with bumpers to protect it. And then last but not least, we have pivot pins. So first we have to determine the mounting point for the tarp axle. And since we have a manual crank, this is going to have a chain coming down. Ideally it would be straight up and down, but in this particular application, since we have to have access to the rear cab door, we need to be mindful of where we put this chain. And it's probably going to end up having a slight angle to it, just with where we have to mount the ground level crank box. We're going to have to get some metal, span this gap here to give us a nice flat surface where we can reach bolts, and it'll be out of the way of everything. So you might have to take a trip to your local
hardware store. We are at the biggest hardware store in Charlotte, Little Hardware.
I'm going to go ahead and attach the mounting brackets. Once we've found our spot, I'm going to make a mark where the holes are. Now that I've got the mounting bracket holes marked, I'm just going to drill through. I'm using a 3/8 metal drill bit. Now what's the best principle for drilling through this thing? Low and slow?
medium speed, and then you just want to keep constant pressure on the back.
Okay? It's going to take a while, so get comfortable.
Straighten your ladder out so you can put more forward pressure on it.
I like Charlie's tip. Charlie's so smart.
All right, so for the case of the crank box that I mentioned earlier, we would want it to be straight up and down vertical. In this case, we don't have access to a welder, so that's why we have to bring this down. I'm going to bolt it securely, side by side. They're going to be all painted and pretty to match. And then this will give us a nice boltable surface for the ground level crank box.
Now that we finally have those holes drilled, we'll go ahead and mount the mounting brackets. There were these old holes here, but we needed to move everything back, which is why we had to drill the new holes. Okay, next side.
So now that we have our mounting bracket, now we need to find the midpoint between the back edge of the mounting bracket and the rear of the dump bed, basically where you want the tarp to end up at the front of the truck and at the rear. So to do this, you can either use 2 guys, or if it's just yourself, you can use 2 clamps. So one clamp we're going to put right in the middle of this 45-degree angle, and this is going to imitate where we want the cross tube to end up. And then the other clamp we're going to put at the rear of the dump bed. If you have a top hinge tailgate, you want to go just to the inside of that. But this truck, it's a solid frame, so we can safely put the rear cross tube at the very rear of the bed. So with our 2 measuring tapes, we're going to have one attached to the clamp extending from the rear of the truck. So what we want to do is we want the 2 tape measures to cross at the same measure, and that's going to tell us where we're going to have the center of the pivot pin on that bottom rail. So it looks like we're crossing right at 67.5. So I want to make a mental note you know, you might have to sacrifice dropping a tape measure just so you can grab your marker. So I'm going to do that. And that was the mark. So that's going to be the center. It looks like this previous system already had a pivot pin. These holes happen to be too narrow for our pivot pin, but I know that I'm going to use the same center point here. After you find your pivot point, we're going to do a look underneath just to see what we're going to be drilling through. In this particular case, it looks like this right hole is lined up right with the edge of this cross brace. So obviously we can't drill through all of that. So our only option is to slightly shift the pivot pin forward or backwards. In my experience, it's best if we have to shift forward maybe a ½ inch to 1 inch. And I think at the end of the day, it's not going to make too huge of a difference at all as far as tarp cross tube placement front to back. The other option would be to weld the pivot pin if you really didn't want to drill.
Really?
All right, so we just found the pivot point for the driver's side, and you might be able to hear drilling over there. So now we're over on the passenger side, and we're just going to take that same measurement from the front of this frame rail just to make sure that it lines up. So I know I'm good to use the same rear hole, and all we have to do is drill a new front hole.
I did it. Next side.
So now that we have the pivot pin hole drilled, what we can do is we can do a test fit. So we're just going to loosely finger tight the ½ inch bolts onto the pivot pin. Then we're going to grab our lower arm with an upper arm in it, put it on here without any springs, and then do a test fit all the way going forward and back. Make sure there's no side obstructions, and then make sure that where we end up at the front and the rear of the bed is exactly like we wanted. So our 4-spring lower arm is a one-size-fit-all up to 24 feet bed length. As you can tell, this bed length is about half that. The actual bed is only 9 feet.
Mine says 1.
So we're going to cut this lower arm so that we have this much room for the upper arm to stick out. And then make sure that you come back with a file to deburr the inside and the outside of the cutting edge. Now, just like we've had to cut down the length of the lower arm, our 95-inch upper arm, which does fit up to a 24-foot bed, also has to be cut down. And in a situation like this, we're probably just going to use one of the 2 included upper arms, cut it right in half. I think that's, what, 47.5 inches? Something like that. We can put anyway.
The drilling part takes up the most time in it. It's going to be painful. It's going to be annoying. You're going to have time to think about your childhood and people you miss and people you need to, write a letter to. Here's a safety tip. As you get close to finishing, the drill bit is likely going to get caught on the last little slivers of metal, and it might want to twist the drill out of your hands. You can tell when it's about to come through, and once it starts resisting on you and making a different noise, just back off a little bit and take it easy and be ready to catch it so it doesn't twist out of your hands. There we go.
So right now we're still working on the dry fit or the test fit just to make sure the pivot point and the length is okay. So I've already put in my 4 set screws, and then I put in my corner about where I want the cross tube to go all the way across at the rear of the bed. So I'm just going to hold this, bring it all the way to the front, and we also see that it's nice. Is that too high?
I'd bring it down a little bit if you can.
All right, so we're just going to shorten it a little bit so it rests along the mounting bracket where we want it. And then we're going to see where it rests on the rear of the bed. And that's a good resting spot for the front of the tarp. Now we can swing it back again to the rear. And we're a few inches short, but again, that's just due to the fact that we had to move our pivot pin forward a couple inches. So this is just the result of what we're seeing there.
Now that the mounting brackets are up there, we can put our rubber bumpers on. And that's just a rubber extrusion. It just clamps down on there. If you want it to be tighter, you can put some adhesive in there or run a bolt through, but usually just the friction of it is enough to keep it in place. Ow!
Is that in your foot?
Whenever you are in a work site and you step on a screw and it punctures your foot, what you want to do is take it out and then get back to work. Can't stop me.
Are you going to pick that screw up?
Wait, I should probably.
All right, so now that we have the lower arm and the upper arm measured the way we want, what we're going to do is analyze how much of the side loading area is going to be impacted by the upper arm and lower arm. And as you can see here, it's a fair bit. So this is a situation where you would ask yourself if you would need an angled elbow, either 30 degrees or 45 degrees, just to bring this upper arm down to prevent any mishaps when side loading. So that buys us a fair bit. So I think we're going to go ahead and run with that. We're going to mark the upper arm right where the extrusion is going to stop. So I'm going to line up the 30-degree elbow on top of the upper arm and mark on both sides where we're going to cut. And I'm also going to put 2 marks through the center where we're going to drill 2 5/16 holes. I'm just drilling through the top side so that after I make my cut and actually put the 30-degree elbow in, I'll have the center cast of the elbow to guide me to make that bottom through hole, just so that you don't rely on the drill bit being straight or not. So I'm going to get my other cross tube half that I have, and then I'm going to transfer the same marks over to the passenger side upper arm.
Sometimes you just gotta be a friend.
And then if you do end up using 30 or 45 degree elbows, it's important to hold on to the little piece extra that you have to continue after the elbow.
Cheers. This water break brought to you by Carolina Tarps.
The hottest day of the summer for us to possibly do this outside. Brought to you by Carolina Tarps.
All right, while Charlie's doing whatever he's doing, I'm going to put the axle bearing into the mounting bracket, which is going to hold up our tarp axle. It comes with these 5/16 inch by 3/4 bolts. It comes with a flange bearing. You can just close that up and then keep them both on the same side. And there's a couple of different places you can mount, but I'm just going to go straight up and down. And then again on the other side. If you tighten this down too tight, it doesn't let this barrel rotate until you get your axle in. Just leave that a little bit loose so that it can adjust to the positioning of your axle once you get it in there. And that way, this part can move around.
So after we have the holes drilled and the 30-degree elbow in, we can put the scrap back on of the upper arm that we cut off just to see what kind of length we're working with, and that should be about perfect. So I've drilled the first half of the holes, and now that I have the upper arm back inside the lower, I've inserted the elbow so that I can continue drilling through. So that'll give us nice clean bolt holes for our 5/16 bolts. I like to put the nylock nuts inside whenever we're working with corners and arms. Just looks a little bit cleaner. And then we can go ahead and tighten these down without worrying about anything. Now that we have that done, we can go ahead and start our holes for the upper half. I'm just going to start it to begin with. And now we can take this and finish drilling the holes. And then now that it's on again, we can finish drilling all the way through. So now I'm going to go ahead and mount the 90-degree corner, so this arm will be fully complete. I got the corner in the upper arm, and I'm going to finish drilling that hole. Now I can go ahead and finish putting the bolts into the upper arm of the 30-degree corner and go ahead and finish this whole arm.
I'll go ahead and show you how to get the axle set up. You may have a 3-piece axle like that. You may have a 1-piece axle like this. I'll show you how to do it on both of them. For this one, we're going to use the 3-piece axle. So you're going to grab the outside measurement of your mounting brackets here. We've got 84 and about 3/4. And the instructions say to come in 2 inches from that. But all you really need to worry about is having enough clearance here to make sure that you don't get bound up. So I usually leave maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch or so there. Remember, if you tighten these nuts all the way down, it's going to be really hard for the axle bearing to move around like this. So we're going to leave that a little bit loose for now. And that way, you can get the right side set up and then tilt it out a little bit. And then you've got the centerpiece. But before we do that, we're going to mark the center of the centerpiece, which I have already done. The set screws on the axle bearings can be tightened with a 1/8 inch Allen wrench. Now we are going to slide the centerpiece into this extrusion. It can be a little bit tricky to line up, and it's good just to start with one, kind of at an angle, and then bend it in. All right, so slide up to about that center point, and now we're going to get the left side on. So again, with the axle bearing loose enough to rock back and forth, I can set this one up way out past the mounting bracket, and then slide that down. All right, and then you might have moved your center mark, so just pull that out. There we go. And then you can kind of test fit that. Again, you want at least about a ½ inch or so. You can come in more if you want. You just don't want it slapping up against there. So give it enough room to breathe there. Now this one, it's a manual system, so we've got the sprocket shaft that we're going to insert on the outside. Now, if yours lines up such that the pre-drilled hole on the axle lines up, and this is far out enough, that's great. If not, get your sprocket shaft set up where your crank box is going to be in terms of how far out from the side of the truck. So you can just measure how far in that's coming and then drill a new hole. We'll do that in a bit. In the meantime, we're going to fasten this into place with the attached self-tapping screws. And there's this little guideline, very helpful, all the way down. And we just do 2 on each side, just to keep it nice and snug and tight. Okay. And then just give it a couple spins, make sure it's spinning real nice. I think that's spinning real nice. What are you doing, Charlie?
This is one of the spanner plates, and we made another one that's going to put right there. And this is going to give us a nice straight vertical location to mount our ground level crank box, because you can see the side of this bed is very channeled, and there wouldn't have been any other place to put it.
Normally, you want your chain set up straight up and down, just because that looks good, and it reduces the likelihood that your chain is going to get slack in it and then rub against anything. In this situation, we just couldn't make that work. So we are going to have to angle it slightly, which means we need to tilt the crank box just a little bit. I've got one of our arms lying around. I'm going to use that to kind of get an idea of the angle. That's kind of what we're working with. I'll make a little adjustment. Still staying centered. It's okay if it's not perfect. You just want to make sure that your chain doesn't end up scraping on that. And when in doubt, give it the good eyeball test. Looks good to me. Once you've got that figured out, just mark where these slotted holes are going to be. And what these slots are going to allow you to do is get the positioning of your chain and then slide up to install the chain, and then you slide down to put pressure back on it. We've gone through and marked where those were, and we're just going to drill at the top of those ovals there. Look at those beautiful clouds. It's beautiful. Once we got the holes drilled, we got the 3/8 bolts set up, and we didn't tie them all the way because you still want this to be able to move up and down in those slotted holes. Once you get your chain set up, you'll have your crank box raised up. When you get your length right, you push down on that to put tension on the chain. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Because we cut this lower arm so short, we actually don't need to do anything special to get the springs loaded on. If you go to mount your springs and you can't get it to line up with the notch and the pivot pin because your lower arm can't go down low enough, then you can raise up the dump bed, or you can take out this left bolt, get everything loaded because it's going to hang down here, and then at the very end, press that up and lock it in. But for now, we're able to get these springs loaded on without any problem. So I'm going to tighten up these bolts and we'll be on our merry way. All right, before you get started, just make double sure that the notch is pointing down. Ladies and gentlemen, the notch should point down. Go ahead and slide that on there. Go ahead and set one up. There you go. Get another one. Scooch it on a little more. Get another one. Scooch it on a little more. Last one. Get it in there and then scooch it on. And push all the way through. Put your other bushing on there. And we'll use the snap ring tool so you can get on there. It's not too hard though. You can use pliers and a screwdriver if you don't have this tool. And now we have what we need to pull this up and load in the upper arms. We're getting the chain set up now. And to do that, we're going to push the crank box in its raised position and then tighten that down, and then we're going to get a measurement. We're going to measure from the bottom of the sprocket inside the crank box to the top of the sprocket sticking out of the axle. And we're going to get that measurement, multiply it by 2, and then take away 2 inches, and that should give us the length of chain that we need to cut. So I'm going to get 1 tightened, and that should be enough to hold it. I'm going to go out on a limb here, fellas, and say that's 41 and a half. 41 and a half times 2 is?
83.
Minus 2 is?
7.
No, 81. It's just 81. So we need to get our chain set up to be 81 inches long.
So when determining from which side to measure and cut your 10-foot chain that we send you, the first thing you want to do is you want to figure out which side has the master link. So whenever we do cut the chain to the right length and we make that full circle around the 2 sprockets, the master link is what's going to join the length of chain.
We're installing a tarp system in the middle of a hurricane. All right, so what I've done is I've marked this with a Sharpie at 81 inches, and we're going to knock out this link here. There we go. We still need to run a bolt through the axle to lock it to the sprocket. So now all we need to do is just look at this and see if we can't get a straight up and down line. I think the sprocket needs to come out a little bit. Take that off. Work to get this sprocket out a little bit. That should do it.
This is where we want the sprocket. We can go ahead and mark the sprocket because we're going to have to take this sprocket out to measure where the bolt hole is so we know exactly where to drill through the axle. So this will just tell us where to put the sprocket back.
We're going to measure from that mark to the hole that is in the stud shaft, 5 1/4. So I'm going to hold the axle back to kind of where it was and then push up against the inside of that mounting bracket and then find 5 1/4. And then we want to drill a hole through this channel here. Put the sprocket in there just to help hold it up while I make that drill. So once you have that hole drilled, we're going to slide the sprocket until we can see that hole right there. And then we're going to use that hole, make sure we drill a straight line right through the axle. You may have a 3-piece axle like that. You may have a 1-piece axle like this. I'll show you how to do it on both of them. All right, now we're going to get our axle set up. And the way to do that, we're going to measure between the driver's side mounting bracket and the passenger side bracket. It comes out to 84 and a half. And we're going to take off 1 inch just to allow a little bit of space in between the end of the axle and the mounting brackets. So once you've got your axle cut, bring it up on top of the cab. And because the axle bearing isn't totally tight yet, it can still move a little bit. So we're going to push the stud shaft in through the outside and then lift up the axle and then push it through until you see the hole line up. And then put your bolt through. Go ahead and tighten that. You don't want to over tighten it because this can bend. It's just aluminum and it's sitting on top of these channels, so those will start to bend. You want to have about 1/2 inch at least of space here, and then tighten the set screws on the axle bearing. Now moving on to the other side. We made our mark on the stud shaft, and that came out to 5 1/4 inches to the hole. So we are going to measure from the mounting bracket. So we're going to measure from the inside of that mounting bracket, find 5 1/4. It's about right there, and then make a mark. I'm gonna double check that. That looks good. All right, I've got my 5/16 drill bit here. So that's through the first side of it. Now that we've got that, we're gonna use the sprocket hole as a guide to make sure we're drilling straight through to the next side of the axle. Get our washer set up. Get that through, and then we're going to tighten that up. Again, being careful not to over tighten. Just get to make contact, and once you see the aluminum sort of starting to deflect, that's enough. Now we can go ahead and tighten the socket screws on this side of the axle bearing. So now we've got our axle all nice and set up. All right, we're gonna get this chain set up. The chain is kind of heavy, and if you're not paying attention, it can get unbalanced and fall off and slide around, and knock you in the head. We're going to clamp this just to keep it from spinning around and knocking Charlie in the head. We like Charlie.
And then we're going to bring it up and grab it. Make sure it's staying on the sprocket because that's an important part. Make sure that the side is somewhat tight. I'm connecting a master link.
Like, there's not footage of this anywhere. Maybe the ring box and chain are certainly less than a quarter wire, right?
Like money?
Yeah.
Yes.
Weight.
So now that you have your master link on and we have all this slack, this is the point where we would loosen the bolt and go ahead and lower it down. And we should see it drop, and there it goes. We still have a little bit more wiggle room in this crank box, which is what we want. And this is where you either need to stretch your leg up to keep the tension down or have a friend put a hand down on the box as we can start tightening down some of these bolts. We can just gently put a little bit of pressure on this chain to get a socket wrench on it as we tighten. So the way these crank boxes work is this handle itself is threaded on a rod that is reverse threaded. So whenever you lefty-loosey, the handle is actually being brought in towards the center of the box. And once it reaches the center of the box, as far as it can, there's a few different friction plates and bushings that make the handle lock with the shaft. So the only thing it wants to do at that point is to turn the chain and sprocket. So this is the motion. Lefty-loosey is actually going to be lefty bringing the tarpy-uppy. And then let's say the tarp's all the way up at the front and we're ready to release it. Since the tarp is going to have tension on it all the time because of the force springs, as you go back, the shaft is going to keep pretty close, tight with the handle anyway. So it's never going to run away from you.
So now we are finally getting the cross tube attached. We're going to check it for the right width, and then we're going to make some adjustments, and then get the tarp attached, and then run the cross tube through the tarp pocket. You may have a single piece cross tube, you may have a 3-piece cross tube. We're going to set up this one with the 3-piece cross tube, which has 2 outer pieces and then a connector piece, and then these set screws that allow those to slide in and out. Loosely setting this one up with the corner in. You see how that lines up?
We need to extend.
I'm going to loosen up the set screws so that this can move in and out, because it looks like we're going to have to pull this out just a little bit. Okay, now that lines up. Now again, you want this to be perfectly parallel to the side of the truck. And you know, there's sometimes you have stuff welded to the truck or the truck is bent. You just want to make sure you have enough room here for the tarp arms to go back and forth. So the 3-piece cross tube allows you to make those adjustments really easily instead of measuring and then cutting and then realizing you cut it too short or something like that. So once we get this fine-tuned, we'll lock up the set screws and then take the cross tube off and put it through the tarp.
So now we're in the mode where we need to put the tarp on.
We can take this back out?
Yes, we can take this back out, slide on a tarp donut, and then we can go ahead and lock down this side.
So anytime you've got the springs loaded on the arms, but you don't have the tarp on yet, at best, it's a surprise. At worst, it could really cause a lot of damage or injure somebody if this suddenly falls to the ground. So it's really useful to use a clamp whenever you are modifying the arms. Okay.
And then we went ahead and put a cross tube bolt on the other side just as a placeholder. So I'm still going to put an arm under this and put a little bit of pressure up just so that I'm not surprised when it pops out. And careful not to hit yourself. And there we go. So do we want to do cross tube first and then axle?
I'd say mount.
Axle first?
Yeah.
Okay. So we know that our inside width is right at 84 inches or 7 feet. Our tarp is exactly 7 feet wide. So what we're going to do is we don't want the tarp to be all the way butted against the inside of the mounting bracket, because that eventually is just going to keep rubbing where your 5 motor mounting bolts are. So I'm going to grab the left front corner of this tarp here. And then our axle has 3 different types of mounting locations. We're going to go with the knurled inlet, which will create a threadable surface. I just really worry about the edge of the tarp rubbing against any of the mounting bracket. So we can see here that we have a little bit of axle showing. And just like that, it's that easy sometimes to over tighten. You need to back out and use a different mounting location. I'm going to move out just a hair. And there's that. And we're going to be scrunching the tarp just a hair. Ideally, you would have it straight all the way across. So I'm just going to leave a little bit of a gap. And we're going to try and spread the gap out as even as possible, just so that we don't get any crazy bends as the tarp's rolling up. I don't foresee us having an issue though. There we go. I only have 5 bolts up here, so I did 1, 2, skip, middle, and I'll do the same thing where I'll skip and then do 2 more on the end. As long as the edges and the center and a couple in between are locked in, you're good. So once we get the tarp mounted to the axle, it's time to mount to the cross tube. The first thing you want to do is you want to put a tarp donut on one side. I think it's just easier that way so that we don't mess with 2 loose upper arms at the same time. We'll actually bring the tarp in from the other side, slide it all the way through, and then we'll come back and put the other tarp donut on the opposite side. So if I was just going to grab the pocket right now and just start sliding it on, I would notice that the webbing is still on top of the tarp, but we want the webbing down so that the top part is smooth. So I need to just make sure that my tarp is facing the right side and it's not going to be all twisted when I mount it. And then it's important that we be gentle whenever we pull this. There is a vinyl lining inside the tarp. It's a little bit harder to see, but the edge of this aluminum cross tube could scratch it. So we're just going to be a little bit gentle. Yeah, again, I definitely recommend having a second person to help just to make life easier. We're just going to make sure to push it past the lip, make sure we're somewhat centered. Now before we put the arm back on, we can go ahead and attach the second donut. I like to make sure that the set screw of these donuts is facing up, just to make sure that you're able to come back and loosen it and tighten it as you need. So I'm just barely going to put anything on it. Come to this side and just match the donut so that they're both on the inside of this frame rail. And now we can tighten those down a fair bit. Not too much because again, we're putting a metal screw in plastic, so you don't want to over tighten that. Okay, and at this point, we can attach the corners back to the cross tube and then go ahead and tighten down these corner bolts, and then we should have a finished system.
Will any other tarp company teach you how to install a tarp system in the dark? I don't think so.
All right, now that we have everything locked down, it's good to double check, make sure any bolt that could eventually wiggle loose is tight. And before we test the system, I think we're safe to go ahead and take off any sort of clamp you might be holding. And it's very important before you get out of the truck, do a final check, make sure there's no tools left anywhere in the truck.
Especially on top.
Yeah, especially on top
on top of the cab protector. I haven't, but I know a lot of people who leave a lot of stuff on top of the cab protector. Now we're going to roll it up. What do you think, Charlie?
Unwind it. I think we need to, it's pulling heavy to the right. Well, I mean, we can keep rolling it up and see what happens, but it's just going to keep going to the right. Yeah, so the right hit first.
The right side arm is touching the bracket already. The left side is not. So we just need to make a little adjustment here. We can either pull the driver's side arm in a little bit and extend the passenger a little bit. Can also shift the tarp a little bit, but that's totally normal. That's part of getting your tarp all set up and finished. So now that there is tension pulling on the sprocket, wanting it to unwind, now when you go to unwind it, now it's not clicking because there's no dog clicking against a ratchet, but like Charlie explained, the handle is trying to unscrew from that shaft, but right as it tries to unscrew, the tension screws it right back up. And the tricky part is once the tarp hits the back, then there's no more tension on it, and now there's no way to keep unrolling the tarp. So you really just need a friend to come and manually adjust the chain or keep on pulling on the tarp. You could do that. That's clearly the best way. Just give it a pull.
Yeah, did we unroll enough so that the tarp isn't wanting to guide right now?
It's like all the way unrolled.
Now we roll it.
What did you change?
I slid this a little bit over. Okay, yeah, that's much better already.
Okay, that looks perfect. Yeah, someone agree with me? Type in the comments if it looks perfect. Another thing to note on this handle is if you pull on it, it extends, and then you can rotate that so that it doesn't try to pick your pocket when you walk by.
And if you've stuck along this far, we appreciate it. And thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Let us know how silly we look. Let us know how you would do it better. And we will use that back at the shop to improve our instructions, our videos, and to help you do this easier than we did.
Nice.
Perfect. Let's get out of here.
All right. Okay, wow, gentlemen. What a journey we just went on.
Yeah.
I cannot give you my thanks enough.